This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop game day faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
What makes a great pair of glasses? At Warby Parker, it's all the invisible extras without the extra cost. Their designer quality frames start at $95, including prescription lenses, plus scratch-resistant, smudge-resistant, and anti-reflective coatings, and UV protection, and free adjustments for life. To find your next pair of glasses, sunglasses, or contact lenses, or to find the Warby Parker store nearest you, head over to warbyparker.com. That's warbyparker.com.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello and welcome, my name's John Bleasdale, I'm a writer and critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Adam Nayman, the author of a whole bunch of books: Showgirls, a study of Paul Verhoeven's cult classic, a book on the Coen brothers, another one on Paul Thomas Anderson, and a new one which is about to come out about David Fincher. So we're going to be talking about all of that. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm sure you can find me. I'm betting you already follow me on Twitter anyway, but if you don't, it's at Dr. John T. DRJONTY. If you enjoyed the episode, please remember to like, subscribe, and spread the word generally. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation.
You're in Italy right now?
Yeah, I'm based in Italy. I live in Italy for like 22 years almost.
That's lovely. Really nice.
Yeah, it's really good. It's very convenient for the Venice Film Festival as well.
So you'll be heading there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing Dune, which is
Sure.
I'm not sure. There's also a sense that I'm kind of primed for disappointment with Dune, because it just has all the ingredients of a disappointment. I'm not sure why.
This is a weird way to broach Dune, but 3 or 4 years ago, so this is before Blade Runner 2049, the TIFF Lightbox did a retro on Denis Villeneuve, and I don't work for TIFF, and yet they asked me to write the program notes, despite the fact that I'm very ambivalent about his films, and more to the point, no one there wanted to write them. It's like he's an interesting problem because it's hard to be too declarative about him. Anyone who doesn't think that he's a gifted filmmaker and technician is just kind of wrong. I mean, the skill is absolutely there. But even though I've written about the films, I've thought about them, I teach Enemy in my Toronto film course, I still cannot, for the life of me, figure out what, if anything, is on his mind while he does these things. He's such a blank filmmaker. He's kind of like a savant to me. He's such a good director, but he doesn't think for 5 minutes about what these movies are about. And that's how he can make something like Sicario. Like, I've met Denis, he's a nice guy. To me, Sicario is such a reactionary, like unpleasant wingnut kind of movie. I don't think he thinks that. And that disconnect is just, for me anyway, the way I think about directors and project and authorship, I have a hard time with it. So I don't know what he sees in Dune. I like what Lynch saw in Dune, which was he didn't see stuff that he liked. And so he fought against it and made a movie that's really like at odds with the novel's tone, but like good for it. I like Lynch's Dune. And even though I think Villeneuve's might be better, I don't think I'm going to like it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. I was thinking about Black Hawk Down today, because that always feels like a movie that sort of kind of evaded its own political ramifications. You know, I mean, I know it's been criticized, but it seems to get a pass from a lot of people.
Yeah, he hugely gets a pass, but also it was a just pre-Iraq zeitgeist movie, even though it's not set in Iraq. It came out before 9/11, and you know, it's aged. I think it was as bad as it always was in that level when it came out. I mean, it's not like time has made it more racist, but it's not aged well.
No, no, absolutely not.
No.
And I mean, Sicario, I think I would put in that same sort of category of a film I could watch and technically go, oh, I really like the way these scenes are done and the music and all the rest of it. But yeah, from a political point of view, kind of horrifying.
Well, it's just so drenched in crocodile tears, that movie. It's like, oh, it's depressing that the beat goes on. And it's like, well, without the beat going on, you don't have the movie. You don't have your corpses hanging from overpasses and bodies stuffed in walls. It's like it's visceral and it gets you. But I find it like quite grotesque. And I find the the treatment of the Emily Blunt character as just this totally passive, bewildered, you know, by the book doesn't get it done kind of figure is just, you know, it's not for me.
Even the film itself at the end sort of actually boldly states that. It's just like, you were just there to sign a piece of paper, you know, and that's it. And sort of narratively, it's the same thing. I thought you were Clarice Starling, but you're absolutely not that.
Well, and again, I mean, believe me, a movie doesn't have to have positive or even like, you know, active characters with agency to be good. I just found that by the time she's got the gun pointed at Benicio, but, you know, can't pull the trigger or whatever else, I'm like, I don't know what this movie's perspective on weakness is, or if it's seeing, you know, a female in this role is inherently weak, but it's not dramatically compelling, and it's just kind of ugly to me. But, you know, when Denis makes something like Enemy, which is funny and a great Toronto movie, living here, it's you know, just funny to see the architecture and the locations, the way he uses them. You know, I'm fully on board. And I actually kind of liked Blade Runner because I just thought that it was carried by surprisingly good Gosling performance. I don't usually like him, but I liked him in this part. He's well cast.
Well, I've got to say, this is part of my anticipation / dread of Dune. Is I found Blade Runner was, in the abstract, everything I wanted it to be,
right,
and in the actual watching experience, really boring. And it was just like, God, do we need to see him get out of the car, walk to the house, go in the house, go to the room, go to the other room, go down a corridor, go to his apartment? It was just like, fucking edit it. Someone just you know, start the scene a little bit later and let's. And it just seemed to be about someone walking around, and that was it was almost like they wanted to get back to what Harrison Ford had criticized the original Blade Runner for, not having any detecting, and they just wanted it to be nothing but him walking around and doing stuff.
Well, in that sense, it's a weird recognition of what still holds up about the original, which is the downtime. I mean, look, I didn't find the film particularly exciting, but it had a kind of a bleak integrity to me. But no, I mean, a lot of people I know found it boring, and a lot of people I know couldn't stand the Gosling performance. I usually can't stand him in anything else, but I kind of like him as a drone. It's what he is.
A Disney Club replicant.
A drone trying to conjure up some emotions. I'm like, good casting. You know, not bad. And again, I was a sucker. I mean, and I am a sucker. I was a sucker for dilapidated Las Vegas and dilapidated Harrison Ford and the Elvis holograms and stuff. I was like, all right, you know, it's taken us an hour and 45 minutes to get to this point, but this is pretty fun. Anybody but Jared Leto, and maybe it would have gotten over the top.
Oh, yeah. Speaking of bleak integrity, how did you start in the writing business? How did you
bleak integrity? maybe oblique integrity. No, I mean, I got very lucky. I'm a kid of two journalists. When I was 12 or 13, my mom, Evelyn, who I also got a lot of my movie taste from, certainly my love for bleak 70s movies, like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Carrie and Chinatown. I kind of grew up on those on the video shelf at home. And when I was 12 or 13, I was spending so much time reading books, like not just Roger Ebert, which I got at the library, which I think was age appropriate, but also like Stanley Kaufman and Pauline Kael, which didn't mean I was smart reading them. I was just trying to and struggling with some of the references and the allusions and the vocabulary. But I told my mom when I was 12, I kind of want to be a film critic. And instead of being horrified, as she should have been, she was like, okay. So, she, my parents were both on board. They always asked me to talk about what I was watching, and they would dutifully read, when I would type up reviews when I was 13 or 14 of, Pulp Fiction and stuff. And, this hyperbolic high school prose, right? But also, I think because I consumed so much of it, and a big influence for me was the guy who reviewed films in Toronto for the Globe and Mail, who's not famous internationally, but within Canada, he's sort of, I think, one of the more important film critics, a writer named Jay Scott, who was a very flamboyant, not always out gay, but towards the end of his life, recognized gay film critic writing in Canada's national paper, who had a real kind of set of subcultural interests and real irreverence sometimes about high art movies. I mean, he was a Kalian. He didn't have Kale's taste, but he had that same complicitous way of writing where he's like, I feel this way, so maybe you do too, And I imbibed all that stuff. And pretty early on, when I was 15, 16, 17, I could approximate it, right? I guess my first ever editor is a woman who I still owe a lot to, named Catherine Tunnicliffe, who's not working in media anymore, as far as I know, in Toronto. It was almost 20 years ago. She was the arts editor at iWeekly, which was a Toronto alternative weekly, one of the two at the time in the city, along with Now. Now magazine still exists. iWeekly is dead. But, she looked at some clippings that I'd done for university papers. Like I reviewed Croupier with Clive Owen and Lynn Ramsey's film Ratcatcher. And I think maybe it was more the fact that a 19-year-old had sought out and written about those movies more than the quality of actually writing about them. She said, I could do worse than to throw you at some new releases. And so in 2000, this was like, I was a full-time university student, but, I'd get an email, which I could only check once a day at that point. There's something screening on a Wednesday night. Can you go? I would call my phone at home and check my answering machine and see if I was, being sent a movie. And I would go to mostly the kind of movies that you go to as a stringer. And they're movies that in some, I have a file somewhere of everything I wrote for iWeekly over the years. It was hundreds of pieces over the years, but, like third tier horror movies. Saturday morning, you'd go see family stuff, but also some really arty things. And the lead critic, who's one of my favorite people in the world still, Jason Anderson, who writes for CinemaScope and Sight and Sound and Mojo, and we're still very good friends. He saw me coming, and as a guy a few years older, he could have been super territorial. I was 20, and Jay at that time would have been 25, 26. And, he was writing the lead pieces, the 900-word, 1,200-word pieces, and I was writing the 200, 300-word reviews. And instead of being defensive, he just said, hey, let's share pieces. Let's become friends. Let's have taste. Can't overstate what that meant at the time. And then the first year I covered TIFF, which was also the year of September 11th, which was just a bizarre set of memories. Yeah. I managed to do some things like interview David Lynch when I was 20 and write about Mulholland Drive. And I think that and a few other pieces, the magazine started trusting me, and it was almost like Jason and I traded off on lead features and assignments. And then some other magazines in Canada reached out, because at that time it's like a cool young writer thing. 20 years later, that seems so far away. I just want to vomit. I mean, I'm old now and tired, but at 20, this was pretty heady stuff. And you never thought about how much exhibition was going to change, how much distribution was going to change, about how much the role of the critic was going to change when advertising disappeared and then you lose interview opportunities. But this was a time where you sort of felt like, oh man, I just gave, Claire Peplow's Triumph of Love 3.5 stars. That means 20 more people are going to go see it at the Carlton Theatre in Toronto. And whether that was true or not, that was how it felt.
Right.
Very romantic set of memories there.
So with that sort of grounding, you have, because I feel like if somebody's starting today, and I might be wrong, but if somebody's starting today, I feel that there's a sort of weightlessness to the thing, that everybody's got an opinion, everybody's got a thing, and nobody will, as you say, affect sort of box office by maybe you'll just join the avalanche, but other than that, you're just a snowflake.
There are sometimes individual critics or individual pieces or individual reactions against critics and pieces that feel like they kind of move the needle. I mean, to use a really contemporary example, it legitimately has been people on Letterboxd writing about The Empty Man that got that film then coverage in actual mainstream outlets and precincts, which in turn may have some effect on like its status, like will it ever be on Blu-ray, or will it be added to a high-end streaming service, or I guess within contemporary horror, will it sort of be canonized? And it's not overstating the case. I'm not like some Letterboxd review of The Empty Man is not Pauline Kael's review of Nashville, but like it does still happen that interesting people saying interesting things about interesting movies, can make a difference. I've seen it happen on the ground at festivals, or I've seen it happen in the virtual nexus of the internet. I mean, I've always thought that we are living, each year it becomes more true that there's more good film criticism being written than at any point in history. But that's just because there's more film criticism being written, and there's also more bad film criticism being written than at any point in history. And it really becomes overwhelming to try and scan or have any like overarching sense of the terrain. And I think the people who pretend to don't, because even some of the really smart critics, really good ones, salaried ones or tenured ones, have a certain amount of contempt for Letterboxd, and they shouldn't, because there's really good stuff. I mean, there's unbearable stuff on Letterboxd. There's stuff on Letterboxd that does make you want to blow your brains out, but that's because it's a user-generated site. No one's making money doing it. I mean, I guess the Patreon people are. And similarly, the kids or young people on Letterboxd or old people on Letterboxd or on forums or on Twitter who say, contemporary film criticism is bad and film critics should be, executed or whatever, they're not actually reading good people. They're there. So I'm very optimistic and positive about the state of play, but that's in the larger context of, as you say, there's a weightlessness, there's a lack of pull, there is a kind of lack of gravity. I think that also ties into this feeling, correct or not, that most movies aren't worth writing about, which I don't agree with, but I feel it anyway. I don't think it's true, but I understand where the feeling comes from, and I am suffused by it several times a month, especially if I'm reviewing new releases.
Yeah, I mean, I just got back from, I'm not sure if you went to Cannes this year.
No, I wish. I want to know how Benedetta actually is, because I don't trust anybody.
Yeah, it's not great. I'll give you a little bit of my review, which is, it's just too clean. It's really
right.
It's really predictably shocking, and the most shocking thing Verhoeven could have done would have been to actually sort of take it a bit more seriously and actually do something which wasn't just so obviously. I mean, the question is now, who are you provoking? And as I say, it's just all clean. It's like a soft porn. It's like a Zalman King, version of Sound of Music.
I mean, he's a good filmmaker to bring up if we're going chronologically through my own writing, because Showgirls was obviously the movie that I wrote my first book about.
Right.
There were interstitial things between being a 20-year-old stringer and a 31-year-old with a book contract. But, Showgirls was a big deal. It was like a good movie to pick, and it felt like I was going out on a relatively short limb doing it and whatever else. And it also creates this thing. I don't know if you have it yourself as a critic, but, you can have a certain amount of success, but also a certain amount of frustration when you get boxed in, whether it's as an auteurist or a genre specialist or this particular kind of movie that you're known for. I mean, I have not been self-effacing about Showgirls. I've written a book that has 2 editions, and I've toured with the movie and shown it. But then also, sometimes whenever Showgirls comes up, people bug you or text you or whatever else, and it can feel like you've reduced yourself to that, or you've kind of flattened yourself to that. So like, yeah, I didn't go to Cannes, but I'm such a cliche that on a podcast, when I find out someone did go to Cannes, I'm like, so what'd you think of the Verhoeven movie? And you're trapped by that stuff to an extent. It was a big door opening thing for me. I think I've lived up to it, but I don't quite know if I'm going to not only live the movie down, but live down the fact that every time I show Showgirls in Toronto, my mom comes and asks a question and identifies herself as such, which is great. She's never not done it, but yeah, and she's very fond of Nomi now. She's made her peace with the fact that I wrote a book on Showgirls, and now she just really likes Nomi.
Okay.
She should.
I had to block my mum on Twitter because she would, I mean, bless her heart, she would relentlessly retweet my stuff with little comments and stuff. And it was just like, Mum, no, I don't need this. I don't need you in every part of my life. So I'm afraid.
That's sweet though. Come on.
Yeah, it's like the Angelica Houston in Royal Tenenbaums keeping a book of clippings of Owen Wilson's stuff. You know, it's that kind of, it's nice and everything, but also I just cringe. So I just thought, I'm just going to block you, and I did. And that, I also thought that was funny.
It is, but he'll be grateful for those clippings when everything has disappeared from the internet.
That's true.
I've kept all the iWeekly stuff just because I can't reference it anymore. And as much as I might cringe at some of the writing or the taste, I want factually to know that it was there.
Yeah. I think we're of the generation where having something physically present is important. I can't leave everything in the cloud.
No, neither can I. Hence this overcrowded office from which I'm talking to.
What made you choose Showgirls as your first book then?
Obviously, somewhere in the recesses of my brain, it was a great idea because, it's a movie that's so famous for being bad that if you make the argument for being good, there's a certain perverse curiosity that gets raised. I think that one of the things I tried to get across in that book, and if I had another crack at writing the book from scratch, I might make this even more central, is that really relevant reclamations need time. And it's not possible anymore. I mean, we now deal with backlash and reclamation and redemption on cycles of a week or even a couple days. There's backlash to pre-release reviews of films, and people online start hating movies based on who's reviewed them, not even what the review is. I won't say any of the names out loud because it's embarrassing, but there's certain critics who for some people I know, their praise of a film means the film is just immediately suspect. And that was true back in the days of Saris and Kale and the Paulettes and all that, but it's just so instant now. So, I mean, with Showgirls, you have a rare case of something that's like total consensus one way and then a total shifted consensus the other way. And every time I've showed Showgirls, everyone's like, why did anyone ever think this was bad? And it's a question that makes me happy. But if they hadn't thought it was bad, I couldn't have written the book. Right. I mean, it was a combination of like, this is a savvy idea. This fits for the pop culture series that this publisher ECW has started, which were meant to be these kind of very passionate, argumentative monographs. And, I was the first one that they approved. And I think it was just in line with a couple of shifting tides in criticism, and I didn't start those tides at all. It's such a ridiculous thing to even say that out loud. Of course I didn't. I'm riding those tides. And the Showgirls reclamation efforts had begun years ago. Academic critics, queer critics, feminist critics, you had real lovers of trash like John Waters. And then at the higher end of the spectrum, you had the great director Jacques Rivette, who always said that he thought Showgirls was wonderful. And, I kind of duly cited all these people in the book. It's really actually a book that's a lot about citation and reception and measuring what different people said about the films at different times. But also, I genuinely loved it when I saw it as a teenager. Maybe not with the same language I would have for it now. I wasn't 14 being like, oh man, what did Jacques Rivette think about this? I was like 14 and thinking that it was hilarious. But what I sort of tried to get across in that book is that it's not a question of so bad it's good. It's sort of a question of this weirdly completely transparent hyperbole that the movie operates on. It's both things at the same time. I think you can clearly see it as failed camp, and I think you can see it as wonderfully sharp satire, and I don't think that one eliminates the other. In my MA at U of T, right before I wrote the Showgirls book, it's funny because I wrote my MA thesis on Verhoeven, but not on his American films. I wrote it on his Dutch films. And because in the MA, you're not writing evaluative criticism, you have to write the kind of scholarship that you can justify working for 6 months on and that a PhD professor can, take you to task for. I wrote about Verhoeven's relationship to the picaresque, to this pre-novelistic literary form that's all about grotesquerie and excess and sex and satire, and that all of this bodily excess is like a tour through a romantic landscape in the Middle Ages that's not actually romantic. And, when Verhoeven made Flesh and Blood, that's literally what he was doing. He was like, hey, look, here's shit and tits and gore and rape and whatever else. It's what the period might actually look like. But his Dutch films had a lot of that too. And so, writing about Turkish Delight and Kadi Tippel and Fourth Man, and especially Spetters as a sort of modern chivalric romance with motorcyclists instead of knights, I had a lot of that stuff in mind, that in the grotesque, it's not funny or horrible. It's both. And you can't have something that is genuinely grotesque in the sort of Rabelaisian sense of Gargantua and Pangro. You can't have it if it's not funny and disgusting. And I think Showgirls for 2 hours and 11 minutes is a genuinely grotesque American guided tour. And I think it's in its way, one of the greatest films I've ever seen. And it is, even though there is so much about it that you could argue exceeds or fails intention. And Paul, I shouldn't call him Paul, though I know him. I mean, Verhoeven has told me, Paul, please. Now that's the sort of thing that people tweet about the podcast. They'll go, "What an asshole!" Call him Paul. I mean, what Verhoeven has said, including to me, both on the record and in private, and said to many people, is that he feels that he, in some ways, failed his direction of that film. He thinks the Berkeley performance got out of control. There were things that he and Esterhazy were going for that weren't realized. He is also smart enough, and I believe he is honest when he says this. It's not opportunistic. He said, "I still love the movie, and I love watching it, and in some ways, for him, it gets closer to what he was going for in his American movies than any of those movies." And I would also say, and I don't know what you think about this, that if Berkeley's performance in that movie isn't what it is, no matter how well shot, edited, no matter how great the supporting performances are, all the craft that I think is second nature to him, because I think in his way he's a great classical filmmaker, all that stuff would not matter. If it's a better lead performance,
it would ruin
the movie's nothing.
Yeah.
The performance is awe-inspiring. It's awe-inspiring the way that Maria Montez is awe-inspiring, or the way that, some of the acting in Beyond the Valley of the Dolls is awe-inspiring. It's awe-inspiring. And that's not a put-down. It can't be. It's a compliment. It's a particular kind of compliment, but it's a compliment. If that's one of the greatest films I've ever seen for me, and Elizabeth Berkley is the reason why, ergo, it's one of the greatest performances I've ever seen in its way.
Right.
And I believe that very strongly. And I sort of tried in writing the book more than anything, because Verhoeven's like a scummy genius auteur who, gets to be reclaimed now as an art filmmaker with Black Book and Elle, and maybe with Benedetta. But I mean, Berkley really took the fall. And I tried in the book to be like, I love Elizabeth Berkley in this. I love her. And, fine line to walk, because loving her in this case doesn't necessarily mean thinking the performance fully works, but but man, if you want to see how mean film critics can be, and not the good kind of mean, I mean the kind of mean where you got these men working through stuff that's just so ugly. You go read what daily movie reviewers said about Elizabeth Berkley and Showgirls. It's shocking. And they wouldn't write it now.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I see what you mean. No, I mean, I remember when the film came out. I didn't see it on its original run. In fact, I saw it only like two years ago, I think.
Oh, really?
What I was doing was I was doing a film club for the university where I teach here in Venice, and we watched The Room. And as someone had suggested, let's watch a really terrible movie because we've watched all these great movies. So I said, well, this is the sort of the epitome or the nada of terrible movies. So we watched The Room. And then after a few more movies, someone said, let's watch another terrible movie. Well, I said, I haven't seen the Showgirls, but it's got this reputation. So we watched it there. And it was really interesting how it just the way you framed it as it's not so bad, it's good. That isn't the, if you put it side by side with The Room, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't
not at all.
That way. No. So you can't. So a phrase you used as well, failed camp, comes to mind, where it's just not. It's not doing what The Room is doing. And I liked in your sort of, when you were talking about it, you kept putting in these sort of little caveats about in its way, in the way it does, and it's like a paradigm shift. You kind of have to shift. And the contradiction I feel is Verhoeven, exactly what you said, that he's a really classical, he's a very smooth director. I mean,
absolutely.
The images are smooth. It's obvious there's a real craftsman at work making these films. And yet he often puts material which is completely at odds with that smoothness. So Starship Troopers would be a really good example of something that looks incredible, Star Warsy or Star Trekky, and then it does these outrageous sort of buggy, gory stuff.
And when he does these things in the context mostly of violence, he's recognized by American critics as a satirist. When the excesses have to do with sex and sexuality, I mean, in the case of Basic Instinct, which was an effective movie, they got everyone angry at him. And in the case of Showgirls, whose effectiveness I think is of a slightly different kind, or that doesn't have a solid, let's say, a kind of built-in genre around it. I mean, Basic Instinct is like a Hitchcockian movie with boobs, and that works. And Showgirls is like a Busby Berkeley movie with boobs, and I think it's chancier. But when he does that, tends to make people either like very mad or very kind of sarcastic. You know, I I think that now and having not seen Benedetta yet, when I watch something like Elle, you ask this rhetorical question, you know, who's he provoking? And at least in Elle, I thought the answer to that was pretty clear, which he's provoking the kind of audience that would come to see an Isabelle Huppert movie, and I think quite hilariously. But her performance has the same energy that Berkeley's does Showgirls, to be honest. She's an older character, older woman. She's not in the context of Vegas Showgirls, although her job in Elle is pretty insane. She's like a video game designer for these like pornographic, you know, medievalist video games. You talk about him as a picaresque filmmaker. The video game in Elle is all about dragon slaying and stuff. Huppert has a different control of her instrument, let's say, than Elizabeth Berkley does. But I mean, both of those movies are driven by these relentless, impulsive, contradictory, in some ways kind of impossible female protagonists surrounded by moronic men who hate them, and they direct that hate sort of back at them. And both movies are pretty bleak cultural satires. It's just what he's satirizing in Showgirls is the dumbness of 90s Hollywood. And in Elle, he's kind of satirizing, I think, the preciousness or the tidiness of a kind of art house. You know, I've never printed this, but it's good. I'll give it to you for your podcast, which is that when I met with him in Florida, in Key West, I asked him, I said, so what do you watch these days? Because he's got very classical taste whenever he does lists for Sight and Sound or whatever. I mean, it's good stuff, and you can tell it's what he would like. He likes Wells and Olivier, and he likes Polanski, and he likes Fellini. I think Showgirls is an attempt at a Fellini Satyricon kind of movie. So I said, what do you watch? And he said, I really like Michael Haneke, and he said, I really like The Hangover. And just very quickly, I said to him, well, of course, because you're in the middle of those two things. You know, when you're making Elle, you're making you're kind of making a Haneke movie, right down to Huppert, but you're always going to be the Hangover guy. And I can't say that that's the only like on-ramp to my taste. I like lots of different kinds of directors and different kinds of movies. But that idea of something with that kind of control, that's also so unapologetic and unabashed about its excess and its fetishism and kind of about its stupidity, really, really appeals to me. He's a shameless director, not just in the sense that he's shameless for what he throws at you, but he has no shame himself about what he makes movies about. He doesn't have hang-ups. You know?
No, absolutely not.
And that's why I think that he's closer to a guy like Buñuel, who, depending on what day of the week, is my favorite filmmaker of all time. He's closer to a guy like Buñuel than people will often give him credit for. So how can you put those people in the same sentence? That's sacrilegious. And I'm like, well, if you like Buñuel, you'd know that nothing's sacrilegious, or that being sacrilegious is
the point.
Being sacrilegious is the point. So I would teach Buñuel and Verhoeven side by side. I think Buñuel would look at the scene in The Fourth Man where Jerome Crabbe imagines the guy, you know, as a naked Jesus on the cross, and he's in the back of his mind, he kind of wants to suck him off. I'm like, I think Buñuel would like that. And I'm sure that Verhoeven likes Buñuel. So, you know, those two exist on a kind of continuum for me in terms of my taste. I think Buñuel would be harder to write a book about because there's a lot of really, really good ones already. Whereas with Showgirls, long answer to your question, I mean, just no one had done it, so why not do it?
We were talking with another guest, Tom Schoen, the first guest on the podcast, and we were talking about the book industry in terms of publishing film books, and he was just saying about how you have to pick these big directors, and you've done that with the Coen brothers and with Paul Thomas Anderson. And one example, I don't want to anticipate too much, but one example was Tom was saying, who else could you Tarantino, who else could you do? And he actually offered, I'd like to think you could do a book about David Fincher and get a deal, but I don't know if you'd be able to, just in terms of name recognition and the things. But that's going to be your next book, I guess.
It is. I mean, it's done, and for better or worse, it's done. I wrote it pretty much over a period exactly analogous to the pandemic. I mean, I'm beyond grateful to have this relationship that's a sort of three-way relationship with Abrams and Little White Lies.
Right.
The Coen book was sort of a test balloon that I think went well. I think that of the three, the Coens are the filmmakers who I gravitate towards the most naturally. It's not about ranking or better. I mean, there's too much rhetoric about those filmmakers in terms of things like ranking and greatness anyway, which if you read the books, I don't do. But the Coens, for me, have always been filmmakers who, and it's very presumptuous, but as viewers, no one can tell us we're wrong in our own head. I've always watched their movies since about the mid-90s and thought like, oh, this is for me. They are so much smarter, I think, than even I've interviewed them, not for the book, but I've interviewed them, and they're smarter than me, and probably you, which is not meant to be rude. They're very smart. And so in some ways, the book seems pointless. You're not going to say anything about the movies that the movies don't know themselves. But I also think then when I would see people write about them and write about condescension to their characters or cruelty, or these filmmakers lack character or their work is uneven, I would sort of say, I don't feel that way at all. So you could argue the world doesn't need a big testament to the quality of, Fargo at this point, but you're going to write about the career, you write about all the books, you integrate the popular reception, the academic reception with some of your own somewhat eccentric ideas about them. And that all got synthesized, I think, pretty well. And I think in that book, I would stand behind the interpretations of the films, not necessarily as being correct, because that's hubristic, but like I'm confident in them. I feel them. These have always been what those movies have meant to me. And even a movie like Inside Llewyn Davis, I remembered thinking an hour after I saw it, like that movie had been with me for a long time. And that's not just thinking it's good or how many stars you would give it. It's just there's something in that movie's bones, in its consideration of failure and solitude and cultural shifts. And should people are you a writer or are you an interpreter? Do great artists need to be alone, or are you part of a collective? Do you have to be a dick in order to show people that you're talented? I was like, I feel like I've been living with this movie for a long time. And so that book kind of just flowed out of me. And in some ways, I think of the three filmmakers, the Coens are the easiest sell internationally, because even though they don't have big budgets, not as big budgets as Fincher, somehow everyone in the universe has seen Fargo. Everyone has seen The Big Lebowski. And probably because of the Oscar, everyone has seen No Country for Old Men. I think Fincher's had the biggest hits out of the three filmmakers, or some of the biggest hits and biggest budgets, and the closest thing to being a kind of franchise filmmaker with The Dragon Tattoo. And I mean, Gone Girl's not a franchise, but it's a bestseller,
Sure.
Closer. But I feel like the Coens are the most universally admired, and that made that also kind of easy too. Anderson and Fincher, I'm not, if Abrams is listening, I'm just being honest. I mean, they were harder sells. I think they were slightly harder sells for me to the publisher, and then maybe harder sells internally for the publisher. But what we found out immediately when the Anderson book came out, and did and continues to do pretty well, there's an incredible amount of warmth and love for that filmmaker.
Yes.
There's alienation, and there are people who think he's a big fat fraud, and there's interesting criticism to whether Anderson is a bit of a fraud or a phony or a poser. But the people who love him, there's warmth, and it is, if you read it, a very warm book. It's not positive necessarily. I'm very critical of those movies, but there is a warmth to the way the book is designed, and a warmth to what works about those movies. David Fincher is not Mr. Warmth in the movies. And I think Mank, I think Mank in particular has made a lot of cinephiles and historians and Wellesians, really like dislike him intently. And his fan base is also, from some point of view, not a terribly likable one. I mean, Fight Club is like the ultimate dorm room film bro, Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse kind of title. Like you would put it on that list with Memento and Pulp Fiction, which means it's in their class as a cultural flashpoint, but it's not a warm one. Even The Big Lebowski, which I happen to think is the Coens' best movie, and also easily their most annoyingly oversaturated title. Who could actually not like it? For me, who could actually watch The Big Lebowski and what that movie is saying and what its vibes are and be like, well, I still don't like it. I think with Fincher, there are a lot to dislike, not to not admire and not to just dispose with, to try and plunge into. But yeah, a filmmaker like that, it's funny. People said, so what movie do you think that is going to get people to buy this book? And I'm like, for better or for worse, it's still probably fucking Fight Club.
Yeah.
A movie that wasn't even a hit.
Yeah, no, but really bad timing, really weirdly marketed, and disappointing box office.
But disappointing box office, but a cultural, I don't want to say footprint, like a cultural handprint, a cultural knuckle
Knuckle sandwich.
A cultural knuckle sandwich that in some ways he's moved past, but in other ways, and in writing the book, this was really clarified for me, in other ways, just cuts exactly to the heart of what is both phenomenally compelling and hugely alienating about this particular filmmaker, in the same way that it's, and I don't think that there's spoilers on this podcast anymore. If anyone hasn't seen Fight Clubs at this point, sorry. But, in the same way that your protagonist is split and his subconscious both exceeds him in terms of knowledge of the way the world works, but is also kind of limited to his own knowledge of the way the world works. I mean, he's an insurrectionist, but he builds it like a franchise, like a corporate franchise. I mean, the Space Monkeys are built in the same image that Norton's day job is in, because you're the voice in your head can't know more than you do, right? So in the same way that Fight Club is sort of self-divided between these two characters, each of whom want what the other has. I mean, he wants Tyler's impossible sexiness and handsomeness and agility and rhetoric, and Tyler's like, I'm not real. I would just like your body. Can I have it? He, in the same way that it's self-divided, it's also divided, I think, between Fincher, the cultural critic, and Fincher, the salesman. It's a movie full of sales pitches and commercial pitches. I was having a conversation with another filmmaker who knows David Fincher very well, David Pryor, who made The Empty Man. We were talking about Fight Club. We were saying it's in the same way that it's two protagonists in a movie, and depending on who you think is the main character, it's a different movie. I'm like, you could describe it with the same sentence, just what order do you put it in? Do you say, I can't believe that a movie like that's about what it's about was made by a studio? Or do you say, I can't believe a movie that's about that and about it the way it was still made by a studio? It's right, how subversive is it really in its form and its release and its existence in the world? I'm not saying it's nothing, but there's a sort of a, can you really fight your way out from the belly of the beast? Can you really make a movie with the global towers of finance collapsing when you also need to open on 2,500 screens? Right. And I don't have an answer to that. But to me, that's a lot more interesting than saying anyone who likes Fight Club is a brain dead film bro. And it's also a lot more interesting than saying this is the greatest movie ever, and if you don't like it, you're a snowflake. You try and find the middle ground.
That's what's crazy about the way we talk about films these days. And you referenced it in terms of Fincher, as well as Anderson and Nolan gets this as well, of this sort of film bro-ness. And it just feels like a real depletion of how we talk about that. But the difference when it comes to Fight Club as compared to sort of Pulp Fiction or Memento or those other films that sort of the posters on the wall of the university dorm, is that it actually stands as this sort of proto-manifesto for incels. So you have that on top of it, which is satirized, but also satirized in a way which is so refined, might not be the right word, but it's incredibly easy to not get it. And I think part of that not getting it is actually part of the structure of the film itself. The satire isn't decisive.
No, well, there's a very stiff upper lip British critic writing in a very, finger up to the lip kind of publication. It was Alexander Walker, and I think the Evening Standard at Cannes, who was like, this is a fascist movie. And it was like the greatest publicity Fight Club ever got, because, it describes accurately the outer form and outer shape of the movie, while not attempting to even probe even if it is kind of a fascist movie, the reasoning isn't probed. And someone might say, you don't have to probe the reasoning. You can probe the reasoning of Triumph of the Will all you want. It's not going to give you a happy answer. The outer form is still what the movie is. And that's the risk that Fincher ran. Right. In making this film featuring an unfathomably charismatic, martial, Brad Pitt as a kind of mix of Kurt Cobain and Che Guevara. He risks that. He risks it being a successful kind of sales pitch. And I have a lot of friends who thought that the film then and now they say the film is incoherent. And I would sort of say, because it's not really one of my favorites of Fincher's movies, though I tried to do right by it in the chapter in the book, I sort of go, well, what's the staying power of coherence, especially for popular political cinema? A movie that's immediately coherent or ideologically satisfying often sometimes has a very narrow cast appeal, or it doesn't give you much to do with it except kind of nod approvingly at it. I think that in a way, Fight Club kind of was Fincher trying to show that he had some thoughts in his head after the movies like Seven and The Game, which are so brilliantly realized and for some people kind of thin, although I don't think that either of them are, but that was the criticism, is that they're kind of thin. I'm not sure that Fight Club's like cultural diagnosis is that apt, but on some level, you have to appreciate the crash test dummy act of the filmmaking. And this is not like white hot insight or anything, but rewatching the film a couple times, I was just stunned by the amount of setups in that movie. The sheer number of setups, locations, angles, perspectives, never just settling for reverse shot when he doesn't have to, never just settling for
I have a secret. I used to struggle with dull, saggy skin. Then I found Spoiled Child's E27 liquid collagen. This extra strength liquid formula, packed with type 1 and type 3 collagen, vitamin C, and hyaluronic acid, makes it so easy to visibly transform your skin and hair. No more chunky collagen powders, just a smooth, delicious liquid that can be blended with any drink. With over 100,000 five-star reviews, this liquid collagen is going viral for a reason. And with their try before you buy offer, you could try your full-size product at home before buying. Take the quiz at spoiledchild.com/quiz. That's spoiledchild.com/quiz. Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop game day faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
2 or 3, points of coverage in a particular location. I mean, it's just so relentlessly alive as a piece of craft. That hasn't changed in his filmmaking, and he's not the only filmmaker who does that, but the size and the sense of building out a world and building out a point of view on these characters really just kind of startling, especially since it's right on the pivot point between analog and digital, both for films in general, but for Fincher, for sure. Because after Fight Club, he decisively maneuvers towards the digital. All the Panic Room was shot on film, but all the CGI camera movements were sort of pre-visualized. And they're impossible camera movements. They're disembodied camera work. They're not meant to make you feel like there's possibly a cinematographer there. And then Zodiac begins that late phase of his career where all of a sudden history and reality and time and verisimilitude become, I think, what he's more or less interested in, even in something like Dragon Tattoo. And you get that digitality, which means that even a movie as gory as Dragon Tattoo for me feels bloodless. That's not even a put down, but it's a feeling that is built into those movies. I mean, I don't know. People talked about Dragon Tattoo and Gone Girl when they like them. They say they like them because of that incredible speed and sense of convergence. And the people who don't like them feel there's no friction in them. Like they're exploitation movies or gore movies where nothing actually looks like it hurts. It's all very artificial.
Violence without actual pain.
Whereas Seven, as an analog movie about in its plot, an analog craftsman carving art into bodies and limbs that's mostly makeup effect, that's where that movie's power comes from. I'm not being incredulous. I'm not like, oh my God, it looks real. But it's a very embodied, tactile kind of horror. You feel it while you're watching it.
I mean, I think the thing with Fight Club, and then we'll move back and have a look at the Coens and Anderson.
Yeah.
But in some ways, it relates to the Coens as well. It's about looking at the film, but it's also the film is sort of discovered by the audience, and so it's that interface. And as you did with Showgirls, it changes. It's like the sort of quantum state. It's like an uncertainty principle, And if there isn't a critical atmosphere ready for a film, then it changes. It can be 2 things at the same time. And then when there is a critical atmosphere, it becomes one thing or another. And I think that moves along. So Alexander Walker saying it's fascistic. Yeah, he's not wrong. Clockwork Orange is fascistic, perhaps even more so. Maybe all films about young men being violent, and maybe we should allow them to be violent, are fascistic. But you have to the audience also has to sort of get in there somehow, and that interface becomes an important aspect of the film, as much as the mise en scène or whatever else.
Well, I was trying to think what a common denominator between these three Abrams books might be, and beyond the cynical calculus of enough people like these movies that they'll buy a book, and the somewhat self-interrogating calculus of these are all white male American filmmakers of a certain generation, which has to do with the availability and popularity of the films, and maybe about how narrow my own taste formation is, though it's not remotely the limit of what I watch, think about, write about, care about. But the other common denominator might be, and this is more true of the Coens and Fincher than for Anderson, but I think I can make the case for all three, of scrupulous control and airlessness in the service of something spacious for the viewer, I think the Coens make films that are airtight, but they are spacious for the viewer, and not just in that chin-stroking way of what is this all about, but you can move around inside those movies, and you can move around inside those performances and inside certain moments. When I tend to tune out with the Coens as critics, even when they like them, they propose this kind of 1-to-1 ratio between they don't like their characters, or these characters are dumb, or this is a symbol of this. And I sort of think, I don't think the movie's made that way. And I think that Fincher, when he is good, like Zodiac, which is not just good, but for me is like a more than its sum of its parts masterpiece. He's a very sum of the parts filmmaker. The movies add up. Zodiac somehow adds up to more than the integers that are in it. It has that ineffable quality where it actually elevates beyond how good it is, how good the intentionality of the filmmaking is. It becomes something bigger because of what it's about, I think. But you can move around a lot in that movie. And I think Anderson is much less of a kind of rivet and steel kind of filmmaker, but he is a formal virtuoso, He doesn't like to trap his characters. He likes to roam, but it's still kind of big dick control freak filmmaking. More than either of those filmmakers, I think he dares people to meet him more than halfway. In the later films, he's daring people to meet him sometimes 3/4 of the way. Even though the movies are messier and I think more overtly humane than the Coen and Fincher movies are, I guess it's not, can I pick some movies and try and have big thoughts about them almost at the expense of the movies? It's what movies can stand up to 300 pages of exegesis, not celebration, right? And not just one perfect shot style appreciation, though there is some of that in the way that these books are all designed. But, what movies can you wrestle with a little bit? What's the great line in Barton Fink? Want to see a man wrestling, wrestling, not wrestling with his soul. Well, maybe a bit of that for the critics, And I find the Coens movies are fun to wrestle with. I think Anderson's movies are fun to wrestle with. I think in Fincher's movies, it's more like you kind of bounce off them or you try and punch through them because they have this very gleaming steel box kind of surface to them. But yeah, I mean, with the Coens, I guess the short version is it's fun to talk about uncertainty. And in the case of Anderson, it's fun to look at human extremity and failure. And in Fincher, I think it's just all about advertising. I think his movies are all about a culture and a psychology of advertising and messaging, which is kind of what he's been doing since he made that cancer PSA. Right. With the baby smoking the cigarette, which is what made his name in the 80s. And it's where I think you can start redeeming Mank a little bit, because the failings and faults of that movie have been enumerated extremely persuasively if you go read the right pieces. It is very hard to read Joseph McBride on Mank, or very hard to read some sort of more historically oriented critics on Mank and come away with much patience for the movie. Yeah. Or certainly for its script. But I think that as a movie about messaging and about putting something out into the world and then having it sort of be reappropriated and used against you in the way that studio resources can kind of affect people's understanding of the world, the image making aspect of Hollywood, I think it starts becoming a bit of a richer movie. Not necessarily because it's written that way, but because of how Fincher has integrated this interest of his, a long-standing interest into the movie. People have said that Mank would be a better movie if it was made by another filmmaker who wouldn't necessarily defer to his late father's script so much. That may or may not be true, but it wouldn't be, to me, as much about advertising and image making and sort of the psychology of messaging if Fincher didn't make it. Because that's what he's really interested in. This isn't something he dresses up in. This is his whole career, to me. Maybe Benjamin Button doesn't fit that schema as an odd film out, but almost, and it connects to his work in other ways, obviously, in terms of history and special effects and Kubrick, but almost all of his other movies, in some ways, are about advertising and getting a message out to the public and performing almost kind of social commentary in a public forum. That's what I think Gone Girl's about. Definitely what Seven and Zodiac and Fight Club are about. I mean, 100%. So yeah, just trying to work that angle, I think, made the book an interesting project.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about what you said as well about Mank and the script. I mean, my understanding is he wasn't that respectful to his father's script that he didn't bring in a writer and.
Well, he did.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing.
But the bones of it. And again, I should be careful because the Fincher book hasn't come out yet. And I'm not, I mean, I don't dislike Mank as much as some of my colleagues do. I tried to make the best case for it in the book, but he keeps the basic argument. And it's an argument he had supposedly in interviews with his dad, he said for years. The basic argument about Mankiewicz and Wells and credit remains mostly intact. And while I think it's a small part of the movie, really, the Wells stuff, it's not great.
No.
It's
a presiding sort of falsehood, if you want to.
And it's just and it's just not dramatized in a way where even the slant of it or the opinion of it could be interesting. It feels petty, and there's a pettiness sometimes to Fincher where all these movies are revenge against Fox for Alien 3, which to quote Wells on Citizen Kane, and maybe that's a bit of dime store Freud, maybe that's a bit much, but you look at the way he talked about his experience on Alien 3, where he took a job for hire and then sort of got really angry about being treated like a director for hire because he thought actually in the Wellesian sense that he should have total control. And, look at all the control freaks and look at all the micromanagers that exist in his cinema kind of after that. And when he makes a movie that is simpatico with that sensibility, like Seven, a movie that you have to understand, the cops are the heroes, but you don't want them to catch him. You're watching Seven, you don't want them to catch him because the design is so seductive. You're like, I want to fucking see what happens. Stop getting in his way. And then when you realize that they're not getting in his way, but that wonderfully double-edged moment where they find the handprints on the wall that say "help me," which actually is not a cry for help. It's an invitation to just keep doing what they're doing because he needs them in order to complete it. That's when you sort of see that this is a genuinely sadistic film, not a particularly nice movie, but you see what's so great about Fincher at that point in his career, and in some ways he's gotten better at that, which is that sense of convergence and trapping you inside something that's unfolding until you need to see the pieces come together. And in its way, Seven is totally satisfying. The head in the box is a totally satisfying moment, and then the fact that I'm satisfied by it makes me feel like a creep, or makes you feel like the exact kind of low denominator in the audience that people accuse the movie having. Because, man, how many thrillers add up? How many thrillers have any kind of calculus that's not just crossing off plot points, but where it's like, oh my God, the stakes actually raise. And every part of the movie and its ensemble and its characters and its psychology have been brought together instead of deprioritized one against the other or forgotten or left for something else. It's perfect structure. It's juvenile, it's juvenile. And I don't like the last line where he says, the world's a fine place and worth fighting for. No, it's not. And the second part, I believe in the second part, I mean, it's really kind of gilding the lily, I think, as commentary. But you find me, I'm not trying to argue. I mean, you're nodding, so I mean, maybe you just want me to stop talking so you can say the same thing. I mean, you find me a Hollywood thriller of that era that satisfies like that.
The Usual Suspects.
Usual Suspects, but even in The Usual Suspects, which is funny because also Kevin Spacey did it. All I would argue with The Usual Suspects is the one thing that's not satisfying is that you're being had.
Right.
In a good way. I mean, man, I like that movie fine, but it's more of the satisfaction of, oh my God, I was had. Whereas in Seven, I feel the sense of a character's victory and of the victory meaning something, not just getting out of custody, but the victory meaning something about the film world that we've spent the 2 hours in. I think it's like just total.
Yeah, I mean, the dissatisfaction of Usual Suspects is the old, okay, so wait a minute, did he make everything up? None of that was true. There was no such and such, and not that. The one thing I'd say about Seven is there's which I was nodding because I agree. There's a DNA in that movie that runs all the way through, and you have that very first, and I agree, the last, I think the voiceover at the end was a bit of a studio cop out, but even at the very beginning, there's a line Morgan Freeman says where he says something like, yeah, look at all that passion all over those walls. And that just sort of from that one line, you have the DNA of almost the entire film, which is this sort of cynicism and nihilism, I guess, about the universe, about the hostility of the universe.
Well, as I write about that line in the book in saying that, passion on the wall, he's drawing a parallel also between viscera and art. Right. And Seven again is sort of about a PR stunt, but also a form of performance art where, you use other people's bodies as the canvas instead of your own. But, I write about the artist Chris Burden, who, famously got shot in the arm in 1971 as a piece of performance art. The piece hinged on his own being shot. And there's something of that in Spacey's, final gambit. I mean, it's kind of among other things. And you have that in the opening credit sequence with the fingertips being cut off and the sewing together, the hand stitching of the books. I mean, sort of a really, again, hyperbolic and non-realistic, but I think very earnest consideration of what it is to be an artist and an artisan and putting things together. And I mean, in the movie, the sacrifice, I guess, is a moral one as well as a physical one. I mean, what he's sacrificing on the altar of his art is his morality, or he's asserting his morality, depending on how much you're willing to read into this very teenage idea of good and evil. But I mean, Seven to me is genuinely good, pulpy juvenilia. Like, there's a reason that when I was 14 or 15, I kind of thought it was amazing. And then as I grew up, I've distanced from a lot of it because part of me wants to roll my eyes at the packaging of that cynicism. But now that I've sat through so many garbage thrillers made in Seven Shadow without an iota, without a fucking fraction of that skill and confidence, and since I've now come to the question of, who needs morality in art? I don't. I've come back to just this massive appreciation for it. It's one of those things that, even though it's not wholly original, because it owes so many debts, and I talk about them in the book, to Fritz Lang and to Ridley Scott and different noirs. So it's not fully original, but it's not duplicable.
Right.
Maybe not as many people copied Seven as copied Pulp Fiction in the 90s, but it's somewhere in that top 3 or 4 of American movies that gave people a lot of license to try and do the same thing.
Sure.
Literally no one got there. No one has come close.
The Saw horror franchise, I think, wouldn't exist without Seven. And
no, it wouldn't. I mean, I actually think The Empty Man comes pretty close as a Seven-ish movie, where there's a satisfaction that is played out in the arrangement of elements, and you get that sort of like, it has a head in the box moment for me.
Right.
And it's made in a very Finchery way, because Pryor's worked with David Fincher for a long time. But I mean, Seven is still the modern showstopper for me of a certain kind of thriller making. Memories of Murder is great too, except that it's such a different sensibility.
I mean, Memories of Murder makes me think much more of Zodiac. It's a sort of anti. The cops don't do what you expect them to do, and.
And imagine how humbled and grateful I was that Bong wrote the foreword for this book.
Wow, yeah. How did that come about?
It came about in a very humbling, grateful way, which was that I reached out to a producer of his who, instead of ignoring the request, I mean, look, it's not the worst request in the world. I mean, the Safdies did the foreword for the PTA book. I have a byline. I've interviewed Bong before, so it's not like pretending that writers are insects and filmmakers are giants or anything like that. But he's a busy guy coming off of multiple Academy Awards and festival juries and all that, and his producer just said Bong would be happy to. Director Bong would be happy to. He likes David Fincher. I sent him some of the text of the book, and what he came up with is quite concise, but in its own way, what it shows there's one more thing that Bong Joon-ho is good at, which is film criticism. It's a short little piece, but he gets at things about Fincher's cinema, and even in those couple paragraphs that I think are very apt. And he does it without a hint of self-aggrandizement. He really seems to respect Fincher's work. I mean, I think one of the things Bong has been, which is why it was so moving to me to see him at the Oscars talking about Scorsese and some of the other nominees. He is a great celebrator of others' work. And it's not the thing where you become successful enough that you can just, be nice nice about everyone and you don't want to talk shit or whatever else. And some people have already started to say that he's too nice. But if you've actually followed the career prior to Parasite, DVDs that he's appeared on, interviews that he's given, he is a true lover of other people's movies, and he will say so. And, you know, sometimes that makes people feel like a filmmaker is edgeless, or sometimes it'll make people feel like a filmmaker is kind of sucking up or whatever else. But I've always found it really, really endearing in his case.
Guillermo del Toro also strikes me as one of those. There are certain directors who feel like they're real cinephiles, and if they weren't directing films, they would be writing criticism because they would be doing something in cinema. Well,
with Del Toro, and I don't hesitate to say this, if I've said it in print, I can say it here. You know, I like everything about him except his movies. His presence, his erudition. I've seen him lecture. The way he props up other artists, the collaborations he's made. I mean, this is all just like above reproach. He seems like a wonderful man, and I just with one or two exceptions, like I do like Kronos a lot, which I think is a hoot, and I think still my favorite of his movies. And with, you know, maybe little passages here and there, I'm not a fan. And when I write about something like The Shape of Water, which I wrote about for Scope, and if anyone's listening, if they want to read a really negative piece on Shape of Water, look it up under my name. It reads to me like the exact photo negative of the way I write about these other filmmakers, which is not trying to be petty or mean or reductive. It's like treat the movie as a space to move around in freely, but just draw a very different set of conclusions about, I think, the relationship between calculation and earnestness, and to me, the narrowness of what those movies are about. I guess for me, when the Coens play with myth, American myth, Greek myth, cultural myth, I feel like there is not a one-to-one ratio between what they're doing and what you take away from it. And with Del Toro, I've always thought that the nice way to describe his movies is as archetypes, but the accurate way is as cliches. And what's the distance between those two things? Well, I don't know. We all have our own mileage. But I watched The Shape of Water, which I think is one of his worst movies, and everything in it to me means only the one thing. And when you add all those one things up in a line, I don't think they add up to much. It's like really, really, really simple kind of calculus as a movie. And that's not to begrudge other people their emotional responses or begrudge them their affection for certain of the elements that he's working with. But to me, there's so much labor in that to add up to something so small. But he's a fun director for me to write about because I think I'm seeing the movie that he's making. I'm just it's small to me.
Right.
For me.
Shape of Water, I would not pick up any weapons to defend. Yeah, that wasn't. That wasn't one of my favorites, certainly. And I was quite surprised when it won at Venice, actually. But yeah, I definitely like. I think I like his Spanish language films. Pan's Labyrinth and The Devil's Backbone, I think, are two of his strongest movies. But
Devil's
and
Backbone.
I really like Crimson Peak, which is a film that not many people like, apparently.
Well, the idea of Crimson Peak is wonderful. You know, it's like, let's have a budget for castles, and let's have castles and dungeons, and everyone in it is unconscionably attractive, you know, both in just the physical fact of them and the way that he films them. I had actually a little more patience for Crimson Peak than I sometimes have for his fairy tale movies. Like I was with it for a good long part of the running time. And Devil's Backbone, along with Kronos and maybe Mimic, would be the movies of his from the first half of his career, or half-ish of his career, that I would sort of, you know, I have some effect. There's two really good scares in Devil's Backbone that I still remember. They're good little shocks. But I mean, he's an interesting test case, whether you like him or not. And now this is, I don't want to keep bad-mouthing him because he's a nice guy. And I think he's a net positive for film culture because, again, he's such a supporter and such an advocate and a scholar, all these nice things. But we're in a moment, too, where one of the things that I'm really interested in is what I wrote about it in the Scope piece, is this like weird gentrification of genre, where transnational cinema, the kind of cinema that plays at Cannes, to some extent at Venice, definitely in parts of Toronto, it's almost like the global language of film has more become genre cinema. And it's not even what it was in sort of a Tarantino idea of genre cinema, like not a messy and indulgent one, but a kind of very clean, mythic, allegorical kind of genre cinema. It has some of Michael Haneke's DNA in it, because I think there's a lot of Haneke's DNA in like the American elevated horror stuff. Like Haneke didn't make supernatural movies, but when I see Midsummer and Hereditary and the Robert Eggers stuff and It Comes at Night, there's a lot of that Hanekean precision, which is a bit of a transition from Kubrick, who Haneke, one of the few filmmakers Haneke would admit to being influenced by and liking. But Del Toro and Villeneuve and Bong, and then maybe another tier below them, Nick Refn and someone who I like a lot, and I'm in the minority on, Ben Wheatley. They all have
Yorgos Lanthimos, I would have.
Yorgos Lanthimos even higher up because he's had more of an Oscar breakthrough than any of those guys except for Bong and Del Toro with the Favorite. That's become a kind of transnational commonplace. It's not the shaky cam naturalism of the Dardennes anymore. That was sort of the early 2000s cliche, and a cliche that doesn't do right by the original filmmakers, because even if they've kind of faded a little bit now, I will always love and revere the Dardennes for the run of films they had at the end of the 90s and beginning of 2000s. I love those movies. I love La Promesse. I love The Sun. I mean, that's one of my favorite movies, but that's not really the currency anymore. And so the prizes at major festivals for movies like Shape of Water, the Oscar for Bong Joon-ho, they occasion a lot of, I think, very florid, simpering writing about film as a kind of universal language, which may or may not be true, but like what's being spoken by that language, or what's the syntax of that language. And it's a lot of kind of glossy, in its way, palatable genre cinema. I really like Parasite. I have no negative thoughts about Parasite or no buts about Parasite, but that is a movie that is packaged differently by the filmmaker than, Barking Dogs Don't Bite was, or even than Memories of Murder was. And the guy who made Kronos and the guy who made Shape of Water are obviously the same guy, but Shape of Water's got the little, the little bit of humane uplift, as well as the guy being dragged around by the hole in his mouth. There's a palatability there. And even the people who are not palatable, like Nick Refn, who's disgusting on purpose, it's still perfumey. I mean, he literally monogrammed the opening of Neon Demon with the by NWR initials, and his movies are like perfume lines, or his movies are like boxes of chocolates. Yves Saint Laurent. Funnily enough, my favorite thing he's ever made was that TV show that no one liked that he made a couple years ago. I thought that was awesome.
Too Old to Die Young.
Too old to Die Young, because it's so boring and overdrawn and ridiculous that it came all the way back around for me, where I was like, you know what? Fine. You're not hurting anybody by going and spending Amazon's money on this like bizarre Lynchian Elroy thing. Do it. I would rather this than you playing in multiplexes with Ryan Gosling. I hate Drive. I hate it so much. One of my honestly least favorite movies of the last 20 years. I despise it.
Wow.
But Too Old to Die Young, like, go for it, man. That was fun.
All those TV shows, it's like a genre now. Loads of TV shows by major film directors from the art festivals, the film festival circuit, that nobody watches.
I know. Well, this is happening now to Barry Jenkins with Underground Railroad, which is a very strong piece of work. It's
really good, but nobody's seen it. I mean, I loved it, but nobody's seen it. The Damien Chazelle film series in Paris, I watched the first episode. It was great. I really wanted to watch more.
Yeah, I haven't. I'm a walk, don't run guy with Damien Chazelle, but I maybe crawl, don't walk, but I'll watch it. But no, the Jenkins show is good. I haven't watched Lisi's Story yet, which people say is strong. I'm very mixed on Pablo Larraín, but sure, I'll watch him do. I'll watch him do that. I'm excited. Against my better instincts, I'm excited for Kristen Stewart as Princess Diana. I will.
Spencer, which is coming to Venice as well. Yeah, that's another.
I'm a very much a male film critic cliche when it comes to Kristen Stewart. She's my hypothetical read the phone book kind of actress. One of my favorite movies. I mean, I'm saying this favorite movie ever is dumb, but one of my favorite movies of its kind, and one that I was really proud of how I managed to write about it, I thought I wrote a good piece about it, was Adventureland, which I adore. I think is so much better than any of the Apatowish movies that came out around the same time. Maybe the best Jesse Eisenberg performance, certainly the best Ryan Reynolds performance. Bill Hader and Kristen Wiig are great. But I mean, in that movie, Stewart is basically tasked with playing this like impossibly hip, vulnerable object of adolescent desire. She like listens to Big Star in a t-shirt in the swimming pool and plays Husker Du in the car, and just kind of wants to make out all summer. I'm like, this is the best fucking movie I've ever seen. I'll just watch that and like the whole movie, not just but the whole movie basically builds to like driving to go see Kristen Stewart while listening to The Replacements. And every time I watch the movie, I'm kind of like, Jesus Christ, get out of my head, movie.
You're ticking every box, aren't you?
You're ticking every box. This is the most sentimental male savior fantasy, and that kind of self-deprecating geeky masculinity where it's like, no one wants to talk to me and I'm alone, and you find this person and can you do right by her. I mean, it's phony, but it's also not phony with the details about class and money and work and the boringness of summertime. And I just love it kind of beyond, I love it beyond reason. I love the way it's framed with 2 replacement songs. I love Big Star and The Cure in the middle of it, because I'm not an 80s teenager. I was born in 81 and I'm not American. So I'm fabricating a proximity to all this stuff. It's not really me, but I love it so.
Yeah, but we all do, don't we? I mean, we all, that's where we go. I'm interested, it's a really interesting point you made about genre and the evolution of these movies from the Dadans to this, social realism, Ken Loach, Mike Leigh sort of stuff, to something which is more, and that idea of gentrification of genre that you said. I would be really interested to hear what you think of Titane, the Palme d'Or winner this year.
I'm looking forward to seeing it. I was somewhat cool on Raw, but there's clearly a filmmaker there. I thought that was one of those movies that was like a lot of stuff grafted onto a plot that felt like it really could have taken about 10 seconds. I mean, I'm being unfair, right? Because that goes for a lot of other movies. But she accomplished some of what she set out to do in Raw, which was she made something that that does not pass unnoticed. You can't just sort of shrug that movie off. It's dealing with really raw stuff.
Hey,
and it sounds like Titane is in that same vein, or tapping the vein sort of even more deeply. I guess that when you're talking about the gentrification of genre, you're sort of asking, well, what does non-gentrified genre cinema looks like? And that's a really long, complicated answer, because there's reams and reams and reams of genre exploitation movies coming out that you and I don't even see, because they're all made below the line. They're made for online. They're made for streaming and DVD, the way stuff used to be straight to video, or too gross for video, or too gross for release. So we really are talking about pretty rarefied air when we're talking about genre cinema in these terms. But this is sorry, go on.
No, well, the thing is, I could describe what the gentrification looks like. It looks like having Vincent Lindon, one of France's most esteemed stars, who's made his name doing socially realistic films, turn up as in the middle of all this madness and enthusiastically embrace it. And that's not the same thing as Klaus Kinski slumming it in spaghetti westerns financed by German money.
No, and the dread name in all of this, even though he's as American as it gets, the dread name in all of this is Tarantino, right? I ended up mentioning Tarantino a bit in the Coen book and a lot in the Anderson book, not because he necessarily has a lot in common with those filmmakers, but he's the bridging link. The Coens are Tarantino before Tarantino, except you know what? They're kind of safely on the margins. And when they finally break through out of the margins, it's only after Tarantino softened people up for Fargo. Fargo has very little to do with what Quentin Tarantino's movies are about or the way they're made, but it had Steve Buscemi swearing in it. And it had kind of like haphazard, awkward violence and quotable dialogue. That's not why it's a hit, but it didn't hurt. And the Coens predate Tarantino by a decade. And again, we're not ranking people here, but I would trade his movies for theirs in 2 seconds, right? For me. But he mainstreamed it and moved the goalposts in a way that the Coens have only ever kind of done retrospectively. I mean, Lebowski is almost as big a pop cultural nostalgic flashpoint now as some of the lesser or mid-tier Tarantino's, but it's still not Pulp Fiction. And Anderson's never made something at that level either, but his career exists in the way it does because of Tarantino, because all the studios and distributors were trying to find another Tarantino, and that's how Boogie Nights got packaged. It's there in the interviews that were done at the time. You can say Boogie Nights was a movie made from the heart, and you can say that it's a complex movie if you want, but the calculus was like 70s soundtrack and character actors and an R rating and a 2.5-hour running time. It's like, we want another Pulp Fiction.
I totally agree with that. And I mean, I was at university when Pulp Fiction came out, and so I went to see it, and I went to see all the the films that came very quickly, 2 Days
Awful
in the
movies.
Valley,
Yeah, oh yeah.
Things to Do in Denver When You're Dead. And I remember going to see things like The Usual Suspects. It's like, oh, okay, another one of these, and then obviously being pretty surprised. And Boogie Nights, you're absolutely right, was watching that scene with Alfred Molina and the firecrackers. You were just thinking, this is Tarantino, and that I don't think there's any other reason for Don Cheadle to be in a shootout in a diner, except they needed a bit of Tarantino-esque violence.
Well, and it's funny because you've just described the two scenes, one of which is my least favorite, which is the Cheadle scene, and the Molina scene goes so far and over the top that it comes out the other end and becomes a great predecessor to the outbursts that are incredible in later Anderson films. And one of the things I write about that scene is, for all that it's derivative and for all that it's out of control, it's so scrupulously tied to the theme of film being replaced by video, because he's made a mixtape. He doesn't have the patience for albums. He wants instant gratification of singles off the radio in the order he wants them, and that's very coke-headish, Yeah. He's not sitting back with a joint and listening to a record. He's listening to shitty top 40 80s singles. And Anderson picks these 3 songs that are as well curated as anything in Tarantino, but Tarantino tends to use music pretty reverently, whereas, Anderson, I think, uses that music in a very funny way. I mean, the slow motion realization to Sister Christian, the shootout to 99, Red Balloons, I think it's very witty. And I think the fact that it's like a shitty mixtape from a coked out instant gratification kind of, phony is actually tied to what that movie's about. There's all kinds of undisciplined things in Boogie Nights, but I also see the wit of the filmmaker who, after that, especially by the time he makes The Master and Inherent Vice, a filmmaker who I love. And it is a kind of love, like all the skepticism that I had at the time as a teenager of Boogie Nights and Magnolia, and I resisted Punch Drunk Love, which I don't anymore. And I resisted There Will Be Blood, because as a 25 or 26-year-old going to see that with the hype that it got, I was like, no, I'm not doing this. I am not going to let, this hubristic, overambitious filmmaker, I was being a dick sitting down to that press screening. I remember it. I was at the Varsity Theater in Toronto, just fully with my guard up. I had read a couple of emails from friends saying that it was quite something. And it totally, wore me down. But then when I sat and watched The Master, it was a different feeling. And it's a perverse movie to feel this way about, because it's a movie filled with alienation effects. All I could think about for the 2 hours that I was watching The Master the first time at TIFF in 2012 was, I love this so much. Not I like it, or I admire it, or I want to return to it, not I'm going to make up my mind in the morning. I love it. And that feeling that Kale called her book movie love. I mean, sometimes when I'm talking to people, I don't even care what movies it is they love. I guess there's a few deal breakers for me, but I'm just interested in why people love movies the way they do when they love them that way. And I think the whole reason I wanted to write a book about Paul Thomas Anderson in a way was to figure out what I loved about that movie, which is not a lovable movie, but love's the only word I have for how I felt while watching it.
That's really, that's fascinating, because I think there is that love. I think it gets lost a lot in criticism, that we can analyze things, and listening to you talk about Showgirls right at the beginning, and
I love Showgirls.
Well, there you go. See, it is that engagement, and it's almost like whether you like something or not is relatively uninteresting. But when you love something, it goes beyond just a rational ticking of boxes or whatever. I'll give you an example. You talked very early on about the Coen brothers and how you sort of recognize them as sort of kindred spirits in some sense as your filmmakers. I remember going to see, one summer I went to see The Big Lebowski in Bradford at the cinema, and I basically had the day free. I was staying with friends, but they were working, so I decided I'll go to the cinema, I'll see a couple of films. And I watched The Big Lebowski and Kundun. Not a double bill most people would do. But when I came out of The Big Lebowski, I can't even remember which, they must have been in Kundun and then The Big Lebowski.
Yeah.
When I came out of The Big Lebowski, I just felt so happy. I just had this feeling of, I want to live in that film. I want to live in the universe that in which that film is possible. And happily I do. So, and this is when it was released. So this predates any of the sort of dudeology and all the kind of a little bit annoying Monty Python-esque sort of fandom that surrounds it.
What a funny pairing, because they're both about people who are nudged towards enlightenment and towards an acceptance of some kind of responsibility for their actions. You know, it's just that in Kundun, someone is born divine and has to wrestle with that. And in the Big Lebowski, the divinity is sort of achieved. The divinity is achieved in excruciating increments, but achieved.
And the rug becomes a kind of what's it called, mandala? When
sure it does, absolutely.
It's we're tying the universe together now. Listen, I would love to talk for another hour and a half.
No, it's all good.
And in fact, actually, I might well split this into two parts because it's such a great conversation. I want people to enjoy it. But one last thing I have to ask you, Adam, is what film book would you recommend to our listeners?
Well, I mentioned this book on another podcast recently, but I'll spread it around. I love, and it's not a new book, but it's called Un-American Psycho by Chris Dumas, which is a book about Brian De Palma. And I wouldn't say it's an antidote to criticism about De Palma because, you know, a lot of the criticism, positive and negative about him over the years, has been on point. But it's a real act of movie love filtered through this very rigorous academic sensibility because Chris is a smart guy. It's a movie that argues for the poetics, I would say, or the metaphysics of failure and self-defeat, a very political poetics about De Palma is sort of in some ways the most political of the 70s Hollywood filmmakers, the most cynical of the 70s Hollywood filmmakers, but the cynicism comes from a thwarted earnestness. It's not a cynicism about the world in the Polanskian sense that, you know, the world is bad. It's a cynicism about the world in the sense of I've tried to make it better and failed and sort of living with the consequences of that. He sketches how many of De Palma's movies are about people who reach out to help someone and fail, or characters who reach out for help and fail. And he also does really well, I think, to pull Hitchcock out of the De Palma narrative, to deal with him, and then to go more towards Godard, who obviously De Palma kind of abandons in the 70s and 80s during his Giallo phase, but who is really the guiding spirit of the late 60s work, and who I think returned in a big way when he made Redacted. De Palma once, I think, said, I forget the exact quote, but something about wanting to be an American Godard. And my late friend Kevin Currier, who was a very important friend of mine and a real influence on me as a critic, an older guy than me, passed away a couple of years ago. He always said that he knew why Tarantino liked De Palma, but that they were different because Tarantino, he said Godard turned viewers into critics and Tarantino turned critics into fanboys. And it's a bit of a broad distinction, but, you know, I think it holds. And I think that Dumas shows how thoroughly a viewer can be turned into a critic through just exposure to De Palma's films. It's not a cheerleading book. It's not a ranking book. It's not about a filmmaker being great. It's just, what are these movies actually about? And it's thoroughly and truly auteurist in the sense that it pulls together visual motifs, thematic motifs, similarities in acting, and multi-directionally throughout the course of his career. It's not thorough. There's a good 15 De Palma movies he doesn't write about at all. Like, he doesn't really write about Carrie, for instance, which is a famous one. Right. And he doesn't really write about The Untouchables. But the ones he does write about, if you care about this filmmaker, like Hi Mom and Greetings and Phantom of the Paradise, and especially about Blowout and Dressed to Kill and Casualties of War, and then Redacted again at the end. If you care about this filmmaker, it's a brilliant book.
Excellent. Brilliant. So that's Un-American Psycho.
Un-American Psycho. I hope that at least one or two of your listeners will seek it out and order it. It's not out of print. It's available online. It's not that expensive. It's a really, really great book.
Brilliant. Okay. And you know, congratulations on your books. I've read the Coen's book, and I've read the Paul Thomas Anderson book. The Showgirls book I'm now going to order, and I'm looking forward.
Right on. That's another, 8 cents for me, or whatever it is at this point.
Don't go silly.
That's my fee for. But no, I want to thank you for inviting me on. It's very fun to talk about writing as well as about the movies, and this was a great pleasure. Thank you.
So that was our conversation, me and Adam. I think we got into quite a lot of subjects. We covered a hell of a lot of ground, a lot of filmmakers and a lot of ideas. All that remains is for me to remind you that the recommended book that Adam gave us was Un-American Psycho, Brian De Palma and the Political Invisible by Chris Dumas. I should also thank Elliot Atkins for the music and Ali Harwood for the artwork. Until next week, take care.
If there's one thing that my family and friends know me for, it's being an amazing gift giver. I owe it all to Celebrations Passport from 1-800-Flowers.com, my one-stop shopping site that has amazing gifts for every occasion. With Celebrations Passport, I get free shipping on thousands of amazing gifts. And the more gifts I give, the more perks and rewards I earn. To learn more and take your gift giving to the next level, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
What makes a great pair of glasses? At Warby Parker, it's all the invisible extras without the extra cost. Their designer quality frames start at $95, including prescription lenses, plus scratch-resistant, smudge-resistant, and anti-reflective coatings, and UV protection, and free adjustments for life. To find your next pair of glasses, sunglasses, or contact lenses, or to find the Warby Parker store nearest you, head over to warbyparker.com. That's warbyparker.com.